Thank you, Karen Leslie Hernandez, for being on my podcast today called The Mindful Conversationalist. And I'm so happy to see you again because we've known each other from engaging in Religions for Peace International. And it's been quite a while. I can't remember the last time I saw you, probably in Mandesa, am I right?
I think so. Yeah. So that was what, November of 22, I think. Yes.
Yes.
So
2022. It's been a while, right? So it's lovely to be in this space and see you again. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
So I'm not going to introduce you because I want people to know who Karen Leslie Hernandez is. And I want you to unfold in our conversation with your journey. So I know you currently live in Chicago, San Francisco, am I right?
Right outside San Francisco, yes.
Okay, so let's start off there. Have you always lived in America, or has it been a journey from another country leading to this place?
I have not always lived in the United States, which has been such a wonderful, phenomenal educational experience for me. So I was born in San Francisco and raised in the Bay Area. And my former husband was in the Air Force. And so we ended up being stationed in the UK, in England, and that was in 1990. And so we were in the UK from 1990 to I think it was June of 92. And then we moved to Italy from 92 to 94. And so just had the phenomenal privilege of experiencing different cultures and traveling. And we had Katie over there, my daughter, who's 34. And she was born in England. And so, yeah. And then I've also had the opportunity to live in India while I was doing my graduate work. So my first graduate degree, my master's at Andover Newton, I lived in India for almost 4 months in Varanasi. And that was just amazing. And that was my second time in India. And then I was researching the Christian and the Muslim communities in Varanasi, as it's the Hindu holy city. I wanted to see how the Christians and the Muslims kind of fit into that narrative. And it was just such a phenomenal learning experience for me. And I had my own apartment, and my rent at that time, it was 2006, I think. My rent was $85 a month. So just like the perspective of, right, yeah, 2-bedroom apartment, plastic furniture, but still $85 a month. That was just amazing. And then I lived in Mumbai in 2010, I think it was. Then that was for a shorter time. That was for about 3 months. And that was also doing research in the slums of Mumbai. I was working with a women's organization as well as the Center for the Study of Society and Secularism with Dr. Ali Ashkar Engineer, whom is no longer with us. And so that was a phenomenal experience as well. Just not only living in Mumbai, which is such a huge city and so different from Varanasi, but also just being back in India and having that experience. So those are kind of the places I've lived, and then ended up working internationally for Religions for Peace, but I was living in California. I've lived in Massachusetts before for 17 years, but back in California now, and probably will stay here forever. So, so that's a little bit about kind of my living journey, if you will, over the past, I don't know how many decades.
So. No, that's awesome. That's amazing. So you traveled a lot. And it's beautiful because when you travel, you learn so much, right? And of the different cultures and races. So I'm sure this experience must have led into your interfaith journey. I mean, like, what led you here? Was there a specific moment in your faith or in your life that brought you to the interfaith space?
Yes, and that's such a long story, but I will consolidate. So in the late 90s, I had a calling, and I thought that it was to be a pastor. And so for me, it was really daunting because I was a high school dropout who had my GED, which is kind of an equivalent to a diploma, if you will, from high school, and which I think in the rest of the world is secondary school. I'm not sure what it's called. But anyway, I thought I was going to be a pastor, like I said, and so decided to go back to school. And that was just daunting in and of itself, right? Just having to go back to school and do all of this work and had no idea where it was leading me. I went to community college and got my associate's degree. And then I ended up at Wellesley College, which is an all-women's college in Massachusetts. And Wellesley has this phenomenal program called the Davis Scholar Program. And it is for women who are 24 and over who have yet to get their bachelor's. So it's women like myself who have had whatever experience we've had that didn't allow us or afford us to get a bachelor's, if you will, in that kind of normal time frame, right? Right after high school, go to college. And so I got accepted into Wellesley in April of 2002. And so it was right after 9/11. And while this is when we were living in Massachusetts, and while I didn't know anyone on the planes themselves that, were involved in 9/11, our community, because we were in Massachusetts, was greatly affected. We had several community members who lost family members. And so it was traumatizing and, in kind of that second degree, if you will, experience. And it was just something that really moved me, and I didn't understand. And I had this great desire to understand. And, why did 9/11 happen? And so when I got into Wellesley, they had a Peace and Justice Studies program. And that for me was just something clicked. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I'm already a peacenik. So, born in San Francisco, right, in 1966, and so just was so attracted to the degree program. And from when I got in, when I started my classes, I studied Islam extensively and wrote my thesis on Al-Qaeda and why they misuse religion and how they misuse religion for political gain. And so it led me to understand partially, obviously, I'm not in the minds of those men who flew planes into buildings, right? But it did lead me to really kind of grasp why 9/11 happened and the history. It's not just 9/11, right? There's, hundreds of years of history behind that. And so that's kind of what propelled me into the interfaith world. And while I was at Wellesley, I was doing interfaith work in some of the local organizations, and then just went on to get my master's. My first master's was concentrating in Christian Muslim understanding. And like I said, I went to India. And then my second master's was focused in women in interfaith and women in India. And then my doctorate just really focused on interfaith peacebuilding and restorative justice. And what does that look like in that context of, applying restorative processes to interfaith peacebuilding. And so it's just kind of been this evolutionary journey that has unfolded for me that honestly, I never, ever imagined. But I will say that I'm super glad, no offense to all the pastors and priests out there, because I know they do phenomenal work. I wouldn't have been a good pastor. So, so I'm really kind of glad that wasn't kind of eventually where I would have ended up, because pastors and, clergy have a certain ability to be politically correct, to to really kind of hold that space for anyone and everyone, which we do, as you know, in interfaith work, but it's a little bit different. And so so just that's kind of a little bit about how I kind of ended up in this interfaith space. It was unexpected, but I love it. I love being in this space. So thank you.
That's great. But talking about, you had the calling of being a pastor. I also read that you are a Chicana or something. I don't know if I said the word correctly, but with indigenous Mexican roots. So how does that all tie in as you in your faith?
I am still trying to discover that. I mean, I was raised in a very homogenous community, one of the only Mexican Americans in my community. To be a Chicana means that so when you're Chicana, you have indigenous roots. Those indigenous roots can be Native American, or they can also be from indigenous communities in Mexico. I have both of those, which quite frankly, I didn't know I had both of those until I did my DNA. And I was like, what? Right? I mean, and I knew I had a little bit, but I had no idea that it was more than what I thought. And so so, the indigenous roots on the Mexican side, both my parents are Mexican, come from Aguascalientes and, some of the other areas, Jalisco, and then also southern Arizona, that area where there are Native Americans. And so for me, I'm still trying to connect with that part, right? I'm super proud of my roots, but I wasn't raised, quite frankly, to be super proud of my roots, because my parents, especially my father, um, when my grandmother died, my father was 11 or 12. They moved to San Francisco from, another part of California that they were living in. They stopped speaking Spanish. They stopped going by their Spanish names, essentially. My dad's name is Alfredo, and he started going by Alfred. My grandfather's name was Juvenal, and he started going by Joe, right? To assimilate into San Francisco. At that time, San Francisco was heavily Irish, especially where they were living, in the Mission District, which is now heavily Latino. So that part of me, I'm still really kind of trying to connect with and work within. And at the same time, I know it empowers me, and again, I'm just super proud of that. I'm super proud that I'm Chicana. I'm super proud that I have indigenous roots. And how it fits into my faith is I've always been really connected to the earth and to earth practices, if you will. Some might even say that, I'm a witch, or, like, that's okay. I'm okay with that, in that context. But I think we have lost touch, all of us, if you will, and you've done a lot of environmental work, right? So this. We have lost touch with our groundedness and our experience with the planet, and how the planet literally gives us everything we need. And also too, especially Christians, we stem out of that pagan tradition, but while that metamorphosis was happening from paganism to Christianity, paganism is now considered to be heretical, right? Or it's considered to be, we don't want to talk about that part. But the reality is that we still practice Christmas time, a Christmas tree, a Christmas wreath, mistletoe. All of those things are actually from pagan traditions. And so that kind of indigenous connection for me, I find to be, I recognize within my own Christian tradition, and I appreciate so much, because I think that, again, we would probably be better religious communities and religious people and people of faith if we recognized more that connection to the earth and how important it is.
That's so true. Hey, and tell me, like, I like to go back to you mentioned your studies, right? And there's a lot to unfold there. So I like to just go back to that part of your life. So I read that you graduated in spiritual renewal, contemplative practice, and strategic leadership with a focus in interfaith peace building and restorative or transformative justice. And you also obtained a master's in sacred theology, in philosophy and ethics, with a focus in religion and conflict transformation from Boston University School of Theology. Right. So there's a lot that you did there, right? So can you tell me more about this, and how do these concepts lead to peace building and play a role in the interfaith space?
Mm. That's a loaded question. I think, those 2 degrees, especially my doctorate, was, the focus in restorative justice and the interfaith peace building, was the opportunity for me to take literally everything I have learned since I started my education, since I started at Wellesley, to the moment, I wrote that thesis and created the toolkit for my doctorate, and apply everything I've learned, including my experiential education in India, when I went to the West Bank, Israel, right? And so being able to apply all of my knowledge, all of the wisdom, all of the scholarship, all of the education, all of the practical experience, that for me, especially my doctorate, was so, so valuable. And And the degree at Boston University allowed me to go to India, as I said, for the second time, and I was working with women. And Dr. Engineer, people who know Dr. Engineer, I went to the center in the morning when I got there, day after I got there, and literally Dr. Engineer sent me into the slums with a guide that same day. He did not hold back, right? He literally was like, see you later, have a good time, right? And so I had no idea, quite frankly, what I was stepping into. I had already witnessed the poverty in India twice, my first time being there in 2005 for a class, second time when I was living in Varanasi, but I had no idea what I was stepping into, none whatsoever. I knew there was a lot of poverty, but I didn't understand the reality of people's lives when they're living in that space in a slum area. I also didn't realize why they ended up there. And so for me, most of the women that I was working with especially when I was in Mumbai the second time or the third time when I was in India, most of them were widows. Most of them, in India, as many people know, if a woman loses her husband, she ends up being a burden to the community. And so they have to leave the community. And so where are they going to go? They're going to go where the work is. And so they're going to come to the city and they're going to find awful housing, and that's where they're going to survive. And so the women that I was working with, at that time were making $85 a year. And so just to compare that is my rent in Varanasi was $85 a month. And some of these women were literally making $85 a year in Mumbai. And so their rent was something, I don't even know, $1 a month or whatever. So, so the valuable experience of my degrees and my scholarship and my education and mixed in with the experiential part of that has really allowed me to have a very grounded understanding of interfaith work. And by that, what I mean is, one, I'm having a super great capability, I think, of communicating. I understand how to rephrase questions if somebody doesn't understand what I'm saying. I understand how to not touch, a man who's Muslim, because I made the mistake of shaking a Muslim man's hand when I was in Varanasi. And that was really bad. It wasn't bad. It was just really super embarrassing, right? Because he kind of scolded me when I left. He said, don't shake any more Muslim men's hands, Karen. And I was like, oh, okay. Right. And so the learning of actually being on the ground and listening to all the people I've been able to talk to throughout my career and throughout my life, really, those are the narratives and the stories and the experiences that I also bring into my work. And phenomenally enough, what I've discovered too is, being here in the Bay Area and now working as the executive director at the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County, is everything I've learned all over the world is now also being applied to my work here. And so, long answer, but to summarize, I would say, for me, the ability to learn in the classroom, but also learn out in the world, is what makes an interfaith practitioner someone who is capable of navigating, as you know, these very difficult conversations, these very difficult spaces where we're not always there to agree. And we're not always there, quite frankly, in good faith. And we're not always there for peace building, because there's so many angry people and hurt people and traumatized people. And so people don't know how to work within these spaces. And so also part of this work has helped me understand how to work within those contexts and with those groups of people who perhaps might not necessarily really want to be there or are capable of being there because of the harm that they have experienced.
No, that's quite an amazing perspective, because I also tasted a little bit of that when I traveled. I've been to India and I went past the slums in Mumbai. I've been to Bangladesh as well. I spent like 2 months there, and I also visited the slums there, and I was working in the water and sanitation department. and with a NGO called BRAC that helped women. So it brought a more like a humbling experience to my life, to see life on another extreme level. But at the same time, with all that gratitude and appreciation that follows, it gives you an understanding of the world and people and the context, and that it's so multifaceted, but it's also, there's so many dynamics to it. And so it makes you more of a lateral thinker. So
can I just add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
What you just said is one of my favorite memories of, because my daughter was with me in Varanasi, but also when we were in Mumbai, and she was doing some work as well, doing photography work. And one of my favorite memories, it happened twice, where, these lovely women who literally are making nothing, right? They're surviving, but they're happy and they're joyful and they're appreciative and they're grateful. And they're giving us tea and cookies. And but one of the best memories is they were so worried about Katie's and my safety that they would walk every time we went in, because Katie and I kind of started going in there without a guide because we were comfortable and had been there for a month already. And they were so lovely. These women were so lovely, where they would walk us to get a rickshaw. They would tell the rickshaw driver where we were going, in Hindi, because we didn't speak Hindi. And so they would put us into the rickshaw, literally, like put us into the rickshaw, and they would stand there. And as we drove away, they would just wave and blow kisses. And it was just, they were so beautiful and so lovely and so loving. And that, as you said, was such a humbling experience, and just made me realize to, not that Western sense of, oh, I'm so lucky, right? But more just gratitude for these beautiful human relationships that Katie and I were able to form with these women who a month earlier I didn't even know had existed. And so it was just, that's another key to this interfaith work, right? Is that kind of stepping back from my own narrative and realizing the beauty of the human spirit, and how we really are all walking with each other in this journey, and how important that is. So
No, I totally agree with you, because that was my experience in Bangladesh, because I related so much more to the servants of the place, playing games with them, and whether it was whatever, sports games or board games, and in those moments where we didn't even know how to speak each other's language, but we connected on the level of the heart to heart connection. But also, it's so true. Like I've seen people who do not have much, but they are just happy, And yet there's the rest of us who have more than them, but we still bog down with mental problems or something that's making us like unhappy in our lives, yet others but are so much more happier. So that's quite an experience. Yes, it is a moment of it's humbling, completely humbling. So just to go back a little bit of in religion, I want to know if you could share more about it, because for our viewers and stuff, to understand, because I know you engage a lot in theological coexistence, and how does this help in interfaith dialogue and in the interfaith space as well?
So I was actually raised Catholic. And for me, that quite frankly wasn't the greatest experience. And so my understanding of God until I became an adult was super scary being who, if I do anything wrong, I'm going to hell, literally, is what my message was as a child. And so, when I had my calling too, it felt I kind of was like, did that hit the wrong pew? Right? Like, wait a minute, I'm so confused, right? And so, but I think that my relationship with God has been part of my healing journey, and my understanding of God, and or if you will, my re-understanding of God and of the universe and of the spiritual world, has also been super, super healing for me personally. And I think that that's part of this theological work, in answer to your kind of the second part of your question, is that theology and religion, as we all know, for so many years has been used to, has been weaponized, has been used to cause harm, has been used as an excuse for patriarchy, misogyny, right? Hatred, slavery. I mean, we could go on and on and on. And so for me, when I'm doing this work, I consistently have to remind myself, but I also consistently remind the people that I'm working with and the communities I'm working with, is that there are so many phenomenally beautiful facets of religion and of theology. And it is our duty, if you will, as responsible theologians, responsible religious scholars, to ensure that we don't weaponize religion and that we don't weaponize our theological beliefs and that we don't cause harm to communities through our religious practices. A lot of people might say that that's impossible, right? Because of the way religion is structured. Some say, religion is not necessarily divine. It was divine, but humans have, taken over and screwed it up. And quite frankly, I agree with that analogy for some, to some point, right? But that's also a choice, right? The people who are doing that within the theological context and within the religious context, it's a choice. It's a choice to, cherry pick those verses to cause harm to whatever community you want to cause harm to. It could be the LGBTQIA community. It could be, to other religions. It could be to, women. And that's a choice, right? That's a conscious choice to take those theological concepts and to cause harm. And so for us as interfaith practitioners, it's really important for us to not ignore that either, right? To not ignore the reality that people are doing that, because the fact is that we also have to work in that context, right? We have to work with the people we don't agree with. We have to work with, if they're willing to work with us, with the people who cause harm. And we have to work with the people who are interested in learning, even if they're not interested in what's the word I'm looking for? In kind of immersing themselves into a different way of being, right? Because when we're doing this work in interfaith, we really do have to immerse ourselves into an inclusive, pluralistic way of being, right? That allows us to do this work holistically, on a grounded way, true to ourselves, true to the movement. And I think, quite frankly, there aren't enough of us in the interfaith space that are able to do that because of our personal experiences, because of our fear, because of harm that's been done to maybe not necessarily us, but to others in our community. And so kind of looking at, Israel, Palestine right now, right? Like the ability to bring Muslims, Jewish, Arab, Israelis together in conversation is not easy. And I've been trying to do it now since I started here in Contra Costa County, because there's so much fear and there's so much anger, understandably, right? And so when we're in these spaces that theology and religion has to not bend, but if you will, be pliable, right? We have to be pliable and we have to be open. Again, I've had many conversations where people have said things that are so outrageously harmful to another community. And I've had to sit there and go, okay, tell me why you believe this, or why do you feel this, or why do you think this? And I wholeheartedly do not agree or have not agreed. But at the same time, that learning for me is so valuable because it lets me move on in my work and recognize that there are these pockets of people, pockets of humans around the world who are completely contrary to what we're trying to do. And again, we have to work in those spaces. We have to work with people that we agree with theologically and also with the people that we disagree with theologically. So very long answer to your question, but I think that that's probably one of the most important things I have learned doing this work is to work within all of these contexts, which are not easy, but I appreciate the challenge. So.
No, thank you for sharing on that. It gives a lot of insight into the nature of the spaces of conflict, but also understanding there's a lot of trauma and healing and forgiveness that has to happen in the process.
Yes.
But would you say that theological coexistence, right? It's possible to bridge that gap in peace building? Or is it another way for people to just latch on to create more conflict? How do you see it? Or is there a way we can strike a balance in it?
I mean, I totally believe that theological coexistence is possible. And the reason I say that is because we already are theologically coexisting, right? It might not be pretty sometimes. And it's, we can take, for instance, India and Pakistan, right? And the kind of the communal violence that is continually breaking out. We just saw what happened in Kashmir, right? We can talk about the fact that many of the areas of India are always hotbeds like Ahmedabad, Varanasi, there's been communal violence in Varanasi. And what I learned when I was there from both communities is that they're always on the cusp of that communal violence. They're always on that cusp of one person just has to do one thing and that's it. It will start up again. However, what I also learned when I was in India is that for the most part, they are all theologically coexisting. Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jains, they're all literally especially in Varanasi or in Mumbai or New Delhi or wherever you are in India, they're all there. You have a Hindu temple next to a Zoroastrian temple, and so they're literally all theologically coexisting. Again, with the possibility of communal violence picking up. The reality is too, though, is that as we move through the world, as you and I have traveled, right? You are traveling as a woman from your faith. I am traveling as a woman from my faith. We are moving through the world in these travels, and we are theologically coexisting as we do this work. Because if we weren't theologically coexisting, then we'd be killing each other all the time. And so I think for me, there's this notion of theological coexistence that it is unreachable. But the reality is that as we move through our daily lives, we are, as I said, not to be repetitive, theologically coexisting, but we also are learning from each other. However, there's a caveat to this. It is very surfacey, right? It's not the work that you and I do where we're sitting down with people and having these phenomenal conversations, right? Asking each other questions. It's, one thing I'm always encouraging is, don't just say hello to your neighbor who's either Hindu or Muslim or, Jewish, invite them for dinner or, invite them to, a family event or whatever. Get to know them, actually sit down and get to know them. Here in the United States, I can say, especially right now, we are in a moment of dire crisis, if you will. And we are in a moment of fear of, if you will, the other is, in my opinion, the worst it's ever been. And we are in a moment of just outrage. And, with what's happening with the migrant community, my people, right, Latinos being deported, 4 years ago, we were in the moment of Black Lives Matter, George Floyd being killed, right? And so all of these things, especially if we're going to just talk about the United States isn't very good about not only racially coexisting, theologically coexisting. We're not very good at it. However, on the surface, it looks like we're doing great, right? I am surrounded by Hindus and Sikhs in my neighborhood, and I love it. Asians, Mexicans. And And at the same time, I'm lucky if I walk by somebody and I say, hey, how you doing, to get an answer back, right? And so I'm consistently trying to talk to anybody and everybody I can. That's just also who I am. I'm also a chatterbox, but I also just feel it's so important to just say hello. That is part of theologically coexisting too, right? Even if you're in the store or whatever, especially too, to put yourself, I might be Mexican American, or I am Mexican American, I'm Latina, I'm Chicana, but I'm also, quite frankly, very white. I'm very light skinned. And so a lot of people don't know that I am Mexican American, that I am Chicana. So for me, I move through the world a little bit more freely than, say, another Chicana or another Mexican American or somebody who's Mexican who has moved over here to the United States to work. I move through the world much more freely than they do. And so that's part of this coexistence as well, is the ability to recognize that the world is really hard for Muslim women who are wearing a hijab, for Sikh men who are wearing their turban. All of these things inhibit, one, actually contribute to stereotypes, and two, really inhibit our ability to coexist with each other on a level that's more than just, I'm not going to say anything to you, or I'm not going to even acknowledge your existence, where that coexistence needs to be more fruitful and intentional, and give us the ability to really, really connect with anyone and everyone. But again, there's a lot of fear there. So
would you say it starts first with our humanity, so connecting on a human level beyond all these criteria and stereotypes and judgments and classifications of who we are as people? And if we connect to our humanity first on a soul-to-soul level, it transforms the way we interact and engage with each other in our communities.
Exactly. Yes, humanization is probably the most important aspect of this, right? That we humanize each other and we recognize that we literally all come from the same place. And, the reality is that racism and hatred are taught. It is not something, we do not come out of the womb hating anyone. We learn that. And so, we can talk about how racism is a social structure and all of these things, but the reality is that, again, it is, hatred is taught. And so the humanization of anyone and everyone around the planet is, quite frankly, in my opinion, one of the most important things that we need to do, but also that we need to learn. I just was reading yesterday or the day before about, because, USAID here in the United States was basically shuttered, and now literally hundreds of thousands of people are dying because, they're saying right now 300,000 people since February to now have died, especially within the African continent, because USAID has made their cuts. And that's another conversation in itself. But what I was so struck by and horrified by, and literally was weeping as I was reading the comments, people are like, it's not, and these are mostly Americans, it is not my job to pay taxes to ensure that somebody in Namibia or Nigeria stays alive. It is not my job to pay taxes to feed people in another country when we have hungry people in our country. Valid point. However, right? It is not my job to make sure that somebody has health care. It's not my job to pay taxes, to somebody has health care in another country. And I just was reading those comments thinking, this is so unbelievably dehumanizing. Like, they cannot even see the reality, and then I saw things like, I read things like, well, these countries just need to get their acts together and, they need to, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, do you understand the history of these places, colonization, right? Like all of the things that have played into these countries not being able to do what they need to do to take care of the humans that are living in their country. And so while USAID might have a lot that was wrong with it, it literally was keeping hundreds of thousands of people alive every year. And so for me, reading that lack of humanization and the inability to just simply care about a woman in Nigeria who has already lost triplets several years ago, then had twins and is now losing. She's already lost one of her twins, and her other twin is on the verge of death because they are starving. And it's like, how can you not care about that? And so there's that disconnect, right? We are so, if you will, connected through the internet and through globalization and blah, 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 right? We're supposed to be so connected, yet we are so disconnected from the realities of what is happening in the world. And that disconnection is tied up in the dehumanization of anyone and everyone. So you are very right that humanization is probably one of the most important aspects of our work. Because again, sometimes we're sitting with people who we may not like, or who we don't like what they say, or who are making us uncomfortable, or who are patronizing, or sexist, or misogynistic, right? Like all of the things that we face in this work. And at the same time, we, as responsible theologians, as responsible practitioners, interfaith practitioners, as responsible people of faith, we have to remember what our holy texts tell us. And what they tell us is to literally love and appreciate and take care of our human family. There's not a single religious text on the planet that doesn't tell us that that is what we are supposed to do. So we need to do it as hard as it is.
Some valid points, because it's coming down to the fact that the disconnect is starting on an individual level, which is from the heart space, where we've not only disconnected from our humanity, but also putting ourselves in somebody else's shoe, or showing that aspect of compassion, or understanding. So it's almost like, if you want peace, you want love, or all these kind of things, it starts with you. You have to give that, and you have to become that. And then it sort of vibrates in your community. So it's sort of like a micro scale, but also on a macro scale as well. So it's interesting to understand the relationship of this. And then, so I like to go more into your interfaith work. And, at the time you were at Religions for Peace, and you was a program officer of partnerships and interreligious education. And you were involved in a publication. And I actually have the book right here because you gave it to me in my dress. I remember.
I did,
yes. Right. So this book is about, faithful peace, why the journey to build resilience is multi-religious, right? And you were a editor on this. So maybe tell me more about this book. I've read it, but I don't want to share my thoughts on it. I want to hear your thoughts on it. About what it was like putting it together, the people you interacted with, and the message of this book, and what it was meant to bring in terms of multi-religious and interfaith unity.
No, thank you. And I will say that Aza was the person who thought of the title for the book. It was not me. So kudos to Aza for creating the title. But that was a book that honestly was Aza's brainchild as well. She really wanted the Education Commission to do something, as did I, right? Because we don't, this is another thing, with nonprofits and interfaith work, especially, we bring all these people in and then they don't do anything, right? And so, we want to make sure that we, one, utilize their skills, and two, that we hear their voices, And so hence why we brought you to Manresa, right? We needed your voice when you came to Spain. And so that and also just all the other work that you've done. But so for that project, we asked the Education Commission to do this project, and everyone agreed. And what I loved about it is, we had, Sikh perspective, we had Buddhist. Actually, we didn't have a Buddhist. We couldn't get a Buddhist. We had Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Indigenous, and so that was really important to hear all the voices. Also, too, one thing I really appreciated about Religions for Peace, and I still see every day, if you will, some of the mistakes that the interfaith world makes. It's like, if you're going to do an interfaith panel or an interfaith book or an interfaith project, one, it better be interfaith, right? And like, let's have some representation. And two, if it is not gender balanced, don't even talk about it, right? Like, it drives me crazy how many times I will see something that is almost all male. It just irritates me so much. And so that was something that I really appreciated about this publication, is that we made sure that it was gender balanced. And, having kind of that compilation of stories, personal stories, theological perspectives. Dr. Rambachan, whom I love so much, just as a Hindu theologian, just his contribution to the publication was just so valuable. And so as we did that project, it was so fun for me, and to put all of these pieces together. And I will say too that kudos to Soha, who is also no longer with Religions for Peace, because Soha is the one who designed the cover, who put it all together, did all the formatting, all of that, with my help, but she did almost all of it. So kudos also to Soha for helping with this project. But so I think for Religions for Peace, it was super important too to have more publications, because quite frankly, it brings validity to the organization, especially if you're calling yourself an educational institution, or part of your work is supposed to be educational, right? You want to turn out publications. And so that was part of that project too, was to kind of move the organization more towards that mission of education. And so, we first made it available, like I brought some to Manresa, right? We made it available online for a cost, and nobody was really buying it. And so finally I just said, this needs to be a PDF, and we need to make it available to anyone and everyone, right? Because you want also publications and things like this to be accessible, especially to those who used to be like me, who are just starting off, who need this kind of information, who need this kind of these perspectives from these different traditions, from these different religious leaders, from these different scholars, to offer that kind of groundedness in this work and allow us to learn and to grow in understanding as to why this is so important. So so that was a really fun project, and I'm really glad that we did that. And I'm really glad you have your copy. I forgot I gave you one. So good. So.
No, thanks. Okay, that's wonderful. It's nice to understand the background of a publication. So tell me, you also worked at United Religions Initiative for over 7 years, right? And you were in Habitat for Humanity in East Bay, Silicon Valley, and at St. Anthony's in Tenderloin, San Francisco. So tell me more about this experience, because, I'm in the architectural space, so Habitat for Humanity, I understand it from the architectural perspective. What was your experience like, and what were you doing engaged in these spaces through United Religions Initiative?
So, when we enter the interfaith space, kind of as you and I have talked about, right? Because you, as an architect, that's your job, right? And working in interfaith spaces and actually getting paid, as we all know, is few and far between. And so, there's not a lot of work out there. So I feel super blessed that I've been able to kind of move my way through this world and discover different ways to do interfaith work. So at Habitat for Humanity as Faith Partnerships Manager, one of the reasons Eric, my former boss, hired me was to Habitat for Humanity started off as a Christian organization. And so, but all the Habitat for Humanities now they're affiliates, right? That are separate entities kind of from Habitat International. There are still, depending on where you are in the United States or really in the world, there are still Habitat for Humanity, say in Arkansas, which is very much in the Bible Belt, where you walk in and there's going to be a picture of Jesus, right? Which is totally fine. Whereas you come to Habitat for Humanity, Silicon Valley, East Bay, Silicon Valley, there are no pictures of Jesus on the wall. The only reference, if you will, to God is in the mission statement. And I think they actually have taken that out, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. And so one of the reasons why I was hired was to bring in more of an interfaith component, especially with the Muslim communities. And so when I was there for the 2.5 years I was there, it was at the end, it was during COVID. I started in 2018 and I left in 21 when I started at Religions for Peace. But I expanded into the Muslim community. We did some fundraisers and projects with the Muslim community, especially out in Santa Clara County. And it was really fun and, brought in some of the Jewish community as well. And so that for me helped me understand as well, kind of the how to move in an interfaith space when you're not necessarily working with an interfaith organization, right? Like, how can I do this interfaith work, but it's not necessarily, United Religious Initiative or Religions for Peace. And it was really, really valuable for me to move into a space and create programs that didn't exist yet, and to work with communities that they had yet to work with. And so I was super proud of myself, honestly. And, just really had it was just a time for me to be innovative in my position and learn and grow and kind of do things, that were never done before. And people were like, cool, go for it, And so I appreciated that encouragement from the organization as well. And so interestingly enough, too, part of California, especially, so the Bay Area, here in California, you got San Francisco and you've got all the Berkeley, you have all the surrounding cities and counties, San Jose, Silicon Valley. We are literally the most culturally, racially diverse part of, of the nation, really, except for if you want to say New York. So incredibly diverse, like I said, every race, every ethnicity, every religion, right here in the Bay Area. What's interesting, though, is that we are the least religious, meaning, especially here in the Bay Area, meaning that a lot of people don't attend synagogue or church or temple, right? Or the mosque. And it's weird. And so when I was working at Habitat, kind of working in that context, it was very interesting. And, churches are dying around the nation and they're also dying around the world because Christianity is morphing and changing. And especially here in the United States, with the rise in white Christian nationalism, a lot of people are just done, right? Like, and the malicious intent, especially towards the LGBTQIA community from Christians, especially, is just, it's creating even more fear, right, of religion and of Christianity, especially. And so that's part of what we're working in this context as well. At URI, United Religious Initiative, I always joke that I held every position except for executive director because I was doing all these contracted positions. And what I learned at URI was the importance of grassroots interfaith peace building. It is essential, if not, quite frankly, more effective than the high level. We just had an earthquake. It was a tiny one, but we literally just had an earthquake. So, okay, living in California. Anyway, I lost my train of thought. So when we're doing this kind of high level, like what we were doing at Religions for Peace, right? We were bringing in these high level religious leaders, UN officials. It was great. It was fun. It was interesting. But quite frankly, what I found is we're all getting together and we're talking about what's wrong and we're talking about what we need to do. And then we're all going back to our communities and to the UN and to our government positions. And is anything really changing? And that's where I see with United Religions Initiative and the people that I work with at URI, and I still work with at URI and sometimes doing different projects off the grid, if you will, things are getting done, right? It's kind of like, and it's honestly, Marilyn, it's kind of like the work that you did with Religions for Peace when you got that grant, right? When you were going into the schools and doing that interfaith work that was so, so important for those youth. That is grassroots. So you're working with this international organization, but you're working at that grassroots level in South Africa with the youth. And that for me is so invaluable, because that for me is where I feel the real change happens, is on the ground. And with people such as yourself, who, nobody knows what's going on in South Africa with the youth. Like when you told me what was happening with the youth in South Africa, I was like, really? Right? I mean, I had no idea. And so that type of grassroots peace building is, as what you would just mentioned earlier when you kind of summarized what I said, is it all starts in here. It all starts individually with each and every one of us. And then that spreads out into the world, if you will, right? But that is what the grassroots work does, is it's working within communities, but it's also working at that grassroots level with each individual. And the higher level doesn't touch that. And so that was probably, again, my most valuable experience with URI. URI is also present in over 100 countries, and so has a much broader reach on the grassroots level than Religions for Peace. And so for me, just watching the peace builders at work, Musa in the Philippines, and, Emmanuel in Nigeria, and, Karima in Germany, right? I mean, just all over the world, Alejandrino in Peru, right? I mean, all over the world, the indigenous and the people from all different faiths. It was just so valuable for me as a learning experience, and I just appreciate the organization so much. And finally, I'll just say that my job at St. Anthony's had absolutely nothing to do with St. Anthony's is a Catholic organization. It's a Catholic social service organization, but it had nothing to do with interfaith. But it was, and will probably always remain, the most important job I have ever had in my life, because it introduced me to, so the Tenderloin in San Francisco is a neighborhood in the city that is primarily African American, that has primarily been the, if you will, poverty pocket of the city, and primarily has been, if you will, the unsafe neighborhood, and now has become just where basically all the drug dealers go. So all the people who do drugs are on the streets. And it is, when I drive through the Tenderloin, even now, I was just there a few weeks ago driving through, my only thought as I drive through the Tenderloin is trauma. The trauma in that neighborhood and the trauma from the people who end up in the Tenderloin. Most people, it also has a huge homeless pocket as well, because there's also services there, right? And so what we were doing at St. Anthony's is serving meals, literally sometimes 2,500 to 3,000 meals a day. So that tells you too, the food insecurity in San Francisco is off the charts, right? Because it's so expensive. And so many of the people that are in the Tenderloin who are homeless have been pushed out because of the high prices, have been pushed out because of gentrification. And so, they end up on the streets. Usually somebody who ends up on the streets, if they're not already using, will start to use drugs within 4 months, because it's so traumatizing. What a lot of people don't realize too is once you're on the street, once you're homeless, it can literally happen overnight, becoming homeless. We saw that with COVID, right? All over the world. People suddenly didn't have jobs and they didn't have homes. And so you can become homeless overnight, But to get back into a home, back into a stable living environment, it can sometimes take up to 4 years, right? So if you're on the street and you end up using, and then you have to, work with the addiction, or you have to work with the trauma that you've suffered, or the violence that you've suffered on the street. And so it is just this horrible cyclical part of humanity, right? That we don't understand. And so for me to step into that environment was, again, probably one of the most incredible, valuable experiences I will ever have, because it introduced me to addiction and to trauma and to incredibly grateful human beings who this was their gathering space, right? Even if they're living in a tent on the street, they could come in and have a warm meal and have people who love them. And if they needed clothes or they needed socks or shoes or whatever, they could get it. And that for me was just, again, full of humility, right? But also they were just the people that come into St. Anthony's are just so wonderful. And for being on the street, or for being a drug addict, or for being kicked out of your house because you came out as lesbian, gay, transgender, and you're 18 years old and you need food and you're living on the street because your parents don't want you anymore. That, again, for me was just a huge lesson in the many facets of our work as peace builders. It's not just about conflict, right? It's not just about the absence of violence. Peace building involves everyone having everything that they need and the dignity that is involved in that. So, sorry, am I talking too long?
No, it's totally okay. I kind of resonate and relate to you because, you're talking about grassroots initiatives, and my work wasn't only in interfaith climate work, but I did work with the KZN Interreligious Council, which was the youth, and I was part of Hindu Youth Network. And we used to do a street kids soccer. And it was at that point in my time I learned about street kids and what they go through. And there was a safe house where they if they left homes, dropped out from school, turned to drugs, living on the streets, they could go to a safe house, have a hot bath, have a meal, and then get some counseling, get reintegrated into homes again, into society. Or if they didn't want to do that, they just want to come, have a hot meal, talk, eat, and go back on the streets. You do that until you are ready to come back into society. So they gave them that space of understanding and of trying to not force them, because drugs is a big thing that surrounds people that are normally homeless, right? And it was at that moment in time I learned about all this. And we had street kids soccer. So what we would do is we would get this organization to bring all the street kids. We would play soccer with them, barefoot soccer, have a tournament, have fun together, engage with each other. It was interfaith. And then we would feed them meals and then, go back on the streets, because until you're ready to get integrated into society again. But they appreciated that. That right. Moment in time of just being together and playing barefoot soccer, that just connected us in that moment of fun beyond what's happening in life.
And that's so important, because what you're talking about, right, is harm reduction and trauma-informed care. And as peace builders and as interfaith peace builders, that is a skill that not a lot of us have. And so bringing that skill, just as you said, right, that learning and that understanding into our interfaith work is so important, because while some of the people that we're working with might not be addicted, most of the people we're working with have suffered some sort of trauma in their life. And so understanding trauma-informed care is just essential when we're doing this work. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And would you say that, coming out of our conversation, a sort of like a mini formula that I'm seeing, right, when I step back and reflect, we spoke about from the approaching interfaith with these conferences or interfaith dialogue with the United Nations and government and religious leaders. It has a sort of a space in interfaith where it helps, right? Grassroots initiatives. So the actual formula would be, if we could like, sort of marry the both and sort of have a balance between the two, and that it works hand in hand, and we sort of have like a good formula of interfaith unity and peace building. Would you say that is a way to approach things, that it's not either or, but sort of both?
Completely and totally. And if we could just talk everybody into doing that. Right? Like that's the thing, right? I just feel like, everybody kind of has their little separate entities, and everybody, and the reality is that you or I and Religions for Peace both do cross collaborate, right? There are indigenous folks, there are grassroots folks involved with Religions for Peace, and there are high level religious leaders that are involved in United Religions Initiative. I just feel like, that there's still, basically what you said is, yes, that is what we need to do. Because if we keep working separately, I think it's just, we need to have something that brings us together. John Paul Lederach, who is a peace builder out of Notre Dame, who I've been studying since I started at Wellesley a long time ago, he has this peace paradigm that he has where, up at the top, you have kind of the high level leaders, and then you kind of go down in the paradigm and you have this middle level of leaders and, blah, blah, blah. And then you go down to the bottom and you have the grassroots. I actually like to switch that paradigm and put the grassroots up at the top, and then put the, the high level leaders down at the bottom, because it's the grassroots leaders up at the top who are going to be able to tell the top religious leaders and the top UN officials and the top government officials what's really happening on the ground, right? But if you put, in my opinion, if you put the higher level leaders up at the top all the time, right, then the ones who are down at the grassroots level, who are the ones suffering the violence, suffering the trauma, suffering the after effects of, conflict, are just feeling like they're consistently trying to get those religious leaders' attention. So why not switch that paradigm and put the grassroots leaders up at the top? So the religious leaders and governmental leaders and UN leaders down at the bottom have to, not even a question, right? There is no option. They have to go to the grassroots leaders. They have to go to the grassroots communities to get the information to be able to do their work. I mean, it's pretty easy, right? But it's just, unfortunately, we are a top-down society, right? We're a money-down society. We're, who has the most money, who has the most power? Okay, the UN, the governments, right? So we automatically put them at the top. But yes, you are correct. We do need to work more together. We do need to cross-collaborate more together. But I also, too, feel like we have to switch the narratives and switch the paradigm to be able to do that. And people have to be willing to have that happen, to give up their power, right? Yeah.
And I think that was something progressive for me when engaging with United Nations in the G07 process, where they had intergovernmental stakeholder groups, and advisory groups, where you had the organizations at grassroots level and community representatives there, so that they could bring the voice of the community or the interfaith or whatever it was to intervene and also bring collaboration, but also bring and voices of people, and then so they could have the bigger understanding of things. And that was progressive, and I really liked that. So I just want to move on to a few more questions, and I think that we can round up our conversation. After you left Religions for Peace International, you went into exploring a project called the Living Restoratively, Dying Peacefully project. And I know that I attended one of your Zoom meetings, and it was just amazing just listening to the stuff that goes on in conflict area, and some of the things that were spoken of women that get assaulted, in conflict areas in North Africa, and just learning and understanding what happens to them. It was like so difficult to digest, right? But also, you were talking about how, people with trauma and being in conflict, how to die peacefully as well. So maybe tell us more about this project and what it was about, and how did it you got involved in this and what it meant for you in helping in communities.
Well, I'm still working on it. In fact, right now I'm registering the organization, the Living Restoratively, Dying Peacefully project, where I'm about ready to register as a 501c3 nonprofit. And honestly, my hope is that by like next year, that's my job, right? Like that's what I'm doing. Because for me, it's kind of peace building, interfaith peace building in a different, more, if you will, holistic way. And so as I've gone through these years of peace building work, and as you said, right, the stories that we heard that Despina told, Despina has been one of my, I love her. She's my sister from another mister. And, and one of the first days I met Despina here in San Francisco in the Bay Area, it was when I was at URI, working at URI. And she told me a story that I don't even want to repeat. Of a woman that she has been and is working with in Uganda. And, I always tell people things that you never want to imagine happen during conflict, things that you cannot even imagine happen during conflict. And when she told me the story of this woman, I was just like, how does this woman even move through the world at all? And then that story that Despina shared when we had the YouTube session last year on the woman who had her lips cut off, right? And not only that, as I went through my studies, when I was at Wellesley, when I was at Andover Newton, and when I was at Boston University School of Theology, I had the immense privilege of studying with Elie Wiesel. And Professor Wiesel is a Holocaust survivor and the author of Night, and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And so it was such a profound experience for me to be able to study with him and to learn from him and to sometimes, challenge each other. I challenged him a lot because as a Holocaust survivor, many times the things he said were anti-Palestinian, and I struggled with that. And what I tried to do was understand where he was coming from and why Israel was so important. He was literally part of forming Israel because he lived through the Holocaust, right? He was part of that initiative to create Israel. And so he was so conflicted all the time, though, right, with what was happening in the Middle East. And many would say that, he was, not for the Palestinians. But in conversations I had with him, he was very much for peace and for humanity and for the violence to end. We talked about his two-state nation before he died, but my experience more with Professor Wiesel was our last class, one of my last classes with him. He showed us his arm tattoo because, everybody in the Holocaust had the tattoo, the number tattoo to show what camp they were part of, etc. And I remember thinking, when he showed that number, that every single day he wakes up and there's no escaping what he's been through, obviously. And not only is there no escaping, right? Like the minute you wake up, I can't imagine you not remembering that experience of being in Auschwitz, of watching your father die later on, of losing your entire family, your mom, your sister, all of it. But I thought to myself, what must it be like for him to stare and see that tattoo every time he gets up in the morning, or he's shaving, or he's washing his face, or he's brushing his teeth, or he's getting dressed, right? It's always there. That reminder is always there. Just like the woman that Despina talked about that had her lips cut off. How can you possibly, not only are you remembering the violence that you suffered to your person, right? But you have this physical reminder when you're staring in the mirror of this horrific moment in your life that you can never get back and that is left you scarred physically, emotionally, mentally, all of it. And so all of this led me to think, especially when I was doing my doctorate, as as conflict continues around the world and it flares up, and Israel-Palestine is a prime example, right, of a protracted conflict. And we can talk about genocide, we can talk about all of these words that need to be applied to what's happening, but the reality is that Israel and Palestine is a protracted conflict, if you will, in UN, international criminal court language. And what that means is that they know nothing else but conflict. They know nothing else but how to react violently and retributively to whatever is happening, right? There's no other way of thinking because they've never experienced another way of experiencing their lives. And so as I've done all of this work and as I've thought about all of these things and I've studied genocide and I've done all of this, I've often thought, so how do we get past that? How is it possible to forgive so deeply, personally, collectively, worldwide, where you are peaceful and you've restored yourself personally, and that stems then out to your family, and that then stems out to the community, and that then stems out into the state, into the world. And I know that it might sound Pollyanna of me, but I think that is possible. I think though that they don't, people who live in these areas that have experienced this type of conflict don't have the opportunity to actually really explore what that means. I don't know if you remember what Despina said about when they do get money, like when they get grants to do any kind of trauma-informed care or any kind of, mental health work, that they get money for 6 months. And the reality is that especially if you have lived through violence or trauma in your lifetime, it is a lifetime of work. You don't just do a little bit of trauma care and a little bit of counseling and a little bit of work for 6 months and then you're going to be A-okay, right? That is not a reality. The reality is, especially if we're talking about the women in India, right? In Gujarat, right? The women who, when the mass rapes happened, what was that, 2004, 2005, they're all shunned. Literally, their community has shunned these women who suffered because of communal violence, who suffered mass rape. So they've all been shunned into this one community where they all live together, but they've done nothing wrong. They are the ones who were raped. They are the ones who suffered the consequences of this communal violence, and yet they are shunned. And I remember thinking, these women have literally done nothing wrong. And their families won't forgive them. Their communities won't forgive them and accept them back. So how can they forgive? Right? Like, how can you forgive also too? How can you forgive? And I did this work in my doctorate. How can you forgive somebody who's caused you harm, especially if you don't even know who they are? I mean, how do you forgive? So is that self-forgiveness? Is that loving yourself? Is that mindfulness? Is that self-compassion? Yes, all of those things, right? Why should I have to forgive somebody who's caused me harm when they're never going to acknowledge that they've caused me harm? I've experienced that myself, being raised in a very violent, abusive home. I have forgiven my parents. I have a relationship with my parents with boundaries, which is really important, right? And so personally, I understand this on a level as well of I've restored myself. I've done that work inside of myself. I'm able to have a relationship with my parents. I'm able to forgive my parents. And this has allowed me to live a peaceful, transformative life that, quite frankly, when I die, I'm going to be okay. I'm not going to die with anger or hatred or wanting vengeance or wanting retribution, right? And that extends out to anybody who's experienced any kind of trauma. So this is kind of what pulled me into wanting to do my certificate on to become an end-of-life doula. And then when I was I was still with Religions for Peace. And I was in Liberia and Zimbabwe. We met several people, especially one woman whose husband was part of Religions for Peace. He was a pastor and had been assassinated about a year before. And my conversation with her was just so moving. And then I kind of found myself, I was doing my certification at the time, getting my end of life certification when I was over there and doing my homework and everything, and I had the thought of, how is this woman going to ever move on? How is she ever going to have any kind of peace in her life? With this unanswered question of who killed her husband. They'll never know, right? Why did they kill her husband? Why did they, literally assassinate him? And so I just kind of had a brainchild at that moment of, I want to do this work in a different way. I want to do this Living Restoratively, Dying Peacefully project. What does that look like? How can we work with people who've lived, especially women, who've lived through conflict or suffered extreme violence to their person? And how can they move through the world in a different way that makes them whole, or at least as whole as they can be? And honestly, still not sure exactly what that looks like, but Despina and I are talking about, once it becomes a nonprofit, doing a project specifically with women in Uganda who have experienced trauma and violence, and having it be kind of a 1-year project, and getting grant money, hopefully, and then having all of these aspects that need to be included in peace building work, in this interfaith work, in this trauma informed care, but also to having these women as that first cohort. Once we get them to where we hope they want to be, they'll have to tell us what they need, right? It's not just about me as a Western woman stepping in and saying, I think you need this, right? It's what they need and what they tell us they need. Then having them be trainers to other women, right? And so kind of passing that on is a hope as well. So that's a very long story, sorry, to your question, but I just feel like sometimes the interfaith peace building work we do is a Band-Aid. And I don't want to do Band-Aid work anymore, because peace building work essentially is a Band-Aid. We always step in after, right? Look what's happening in Israel and Palestine, right? Like, we literally are just waiting. We're waiting for this conflict to end again, right? For the violence to end again. And so we can't keep doing this because if we keep doing what we have been doing, it's just surface. It's just Band-Aid work. We have to be able, it's kind of like what Rwanda has done, right? After the genocide, Rwanda has really done some incredible work at the grassroots educational level with their children in school. The trauma-informed care they've offered, all of these things. And so I feel like we have to change things up. So that's, again, not quite sure where it's going, but that's my goal. So
yeah, I think that's beautiful. I mean, it's showing that, we've encountered all aspects of interfaith work, and sometimes it just needs to go a little bit deeper. And that deepness is where our calling lies, our purpose lies. We get guided to be there. And it's a journey that unfolds into it, because, listening to you and understanding where we started off from the journey to where you are now, it's quite a journey of learning, understanding, engaging. And also, I think it's beautiful. It's beautiful that it's brought you to this place, because nobody tells you how to forgive, how to die peacefully, how to let go of all that stuff. And it's something that starts with inner work, and every time in our conversation, we keep coming back to that place of the heart space and the inner work, and it starts there and then it unfolds into the society. So I think that's just beautiful what you're doing. Thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for being on this podcast. Thank you for taking the time out, and I wish you well on your journey, and I wish you well in everything you do. And is there any last minute thoughts that you want to share in terms of interfaith and peace building and the work you do before we close off the conversation?
I guess, I mean, more than anything, I think it's, kind of just, if you will, words to those of us who are in this space, that as we do this work, recognizing, one, it is not easy, right? And two, recognizing the cultural relevance of our work, again, being theologically responsible, ensuring that we are truly, truly inclusive, and just recognizing that everyone that we encounter, whether we're in an interfaith peacebuilding space, such as Manresa, or, when I was in Africa, or wherever, or even when we're in the grocery store, that we just need to be kind and mindful and compassionate and self-compassionate and show loving kindness, even to the jerks. Right, and kind of hold ourselves accountable in that space, and to remind everyone too, because so many people are like, and I get down on myself and I get horrified by what's happening, and hence why you reached out to me, right? Because I was, I can't remember what my post was about. I think it was maybe the pending genocide that the United States is facing. I don't remember, but like, it's the reality is that I have to remind myself that there are so many incredibly beautiful souls on the ground that I know and that I don't know, all over the world, who are making sure that women have access to menstrual pads, that girls have access to education, that communities have access to water, that people are sheltered, that people have clothing, that people, domestic violence victims are able to escape, right? All of these things that are so, so important in this space that we are working in this social justice, space. And I'm so grateful for all of them. And I'm so grateful for you, Marilyn, for doing the work that you have done over the years. And, a lot of these people, we know their names, and a lot of people we will never, ever know their names. And so I think that that's just, I love leaving and remembering that for myself, but also leaving that as kind of a reminder that while our world feels like it is burning right now, it feels like a big, huge dumpster fire, right? Like, we are in dire consequences right now, environmentally, politically, religiously. I mean, there's so much happening. And at the same time, those people are out there and they're just diligently every single day getting up, letting their feet hit the floor and doing good work. And so I keep my focus on remembering that, and remembering that there is good in the world, and that we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. And thank God, right, for those people, and for people such as yourself who, really care and who are just trying to be good human beings. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the work you're doing as well. I mean, yeah, I did read your post and I was like, I want you to be on my podcast so we can share more and talk more about these things, because we are emotionally affected by this, because we are in the interfaith space for so many years, doing peace building work. But also, this is the reason why I created this podcast, is so that I've met such beautiful people that's doing such beautiful work on the ground, and nobody sees that side in media. Media is always focused on the negative narratives and, that fuels the hate, that fuels the anger. But let me try to provide a space where all these beautiful people have a chance to share their work, share their journey, but also give their vision of hope and their vision of peace building, especially in interfaith. So yeah, thank you so much. It's been a beautiful conversation. And I'm glad to have met you on this journey in life. So thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you so much. Love you.
Love you too.